Hello and welcome to week 2 of World History. I'm sorry for being so late in getting this up and available to you, but life has been a little crazy lately. But anyway, it's not your problem, it's mine. But we'll go over our 3 lessons this week as we inch a little deeper, still kind of beginning to dip our toes into the Renaissance period here as we're making that transition from the medieval era to what we call the Renaissance, the rebirth. And like I said, in the first week, most of what we talk about is going to be from Europe, our direct ancestors politically and culturally. But we are going to hop around the globe, and we're going to do that with our first lesson this week, where we go to Mother Russia and the beginning of really Russia as a nation. Those of you who were with us last year remember the Kievan Rus Empire about the 11th century, 12th century, where the natives began to form what we would call a country, and they aligned themselves with the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and after that, there were several nomadic tribes that sort of took over that region, what we now call Russia, and we get a return to Russian nationalism under a guy named Ivan the Great, sometimes called Ivan the Third. Not to be confused with the guy we'll be talking about in a couple of weeks, Ivan the Terrible. Ivan the Great, Ivan the Terrible. Yeah, Ivan the Great is the grandfather of Ivan the Terrible. But you'll remember our old friend Genghis Khan, the great conqueror. A lot of his descendants had sort of continued keeping up his empire, the Golden Horde, you'll remember, which conquered 2/3 of the known world at one point. And they still more or less ruled what is now Russia, the Tatar Mongols, we should say, the Tatars, and they had a governance system in place, but they were still basically marauders. They were not the kind to settle down and set up governments and whatnot. They ruled by might, and even though there was little duchies that were under what we call native Russians, the Tatars still controlled things in the region. They demanded that they pay a tribute to them, or they would, wage war against them, sort of an uneasy truce that they were living under. Ivan was prince of the Muscovy region, which later became called Moscow. And the Mongols, or the descendants of Genghis Khan, had pretty much ruled that region for almost 250 years. Now, Ivan the Great had big things in mind. He was already the prince of this city, this municipality, and he wanted to kick it up a notch, and he did it the old-fashioned way, through marriage. He married a woman named Sophia. She was the niece of the last Byzantine emperor. Now, again, a little background here for those of you, this will be old news if you were with us last year. The Byzantine Empire was the Eastern Roman Empire. After the Great Split, the Eastern split off from the West, Rome, the traditional Catholic Church, and they separated from the Western Roman Empire and created its own church, the Eastern Orthodox Church. And much like they did in the West, in the East, they really blended the power of the church and the state with all that implies. Sophia was one of the last royal members still alive from the former empire, and she inherited a certain amount of power from that position, which included power over the Eastern Orthodox Church. Now again, the whole idea of marrying the crown and the cross is problematic anyway, but it was done and is unfortunately still done. When Ivan married Sophia in 1472, the leadership of this large entity, the Eastern Orthodox Church, shifted to him. Feeling his oats, Ivan appointed himself protector of the Eastern Orthodox Church. It was a title, certainly, but it was also sort of a message to those in this region that I'm more than just the prince of this large municipality here. I'm the earthly protector of this large system of churches in Eurasia and Asia. And he took on the attitude of a crusader. You remember the crusaders for the Western Roman Empire and the actual crusades that they participated in? The Mongols, of course, were Muslim. And so in opposing them, Ivan the Great saw himself as a sort of an Eastern crusader, crusading on behalf of the church and for Christ against the Muslim. Another interesting thing started happening here because of Ivan's historic influences. You remember last week we were talking about some of the early Italian Renaissance guys who really, really went back and looked at Greece and Roman culture and drew lots of inspiration from it. Ivan was also drawing lots of inspiration, particularly from Rome. Matter of fact, Russians began seeing themselves as the new Rome. And it really was the start of what we would call modern-day Russian nationalism. Again, what is a nation? It's more than just boundaries and points on a map. It's a state of mind. It's people with some kind of common, not just geographical, but cultural binding point or points. And the people of Russia started seeing themselves not just as members of different cities in this region of the Urals or the Volga. They started seeing themselves as a nation. This is the proud Russia that Ivan began to lead, a new Russia, seeing herself as Rome Part 2. Ivan put it this way, and I'll quote this: "By God's grace we have been lords in our land since the beginning of time, since the days of our earliest ancestors. God has elevated us to the same positions which they held," equating themselves with God's, "and we beg him to grant it to us and our children." So right or wrong, Ivan carried what he believed to be his God-given power to the people. And he was mostly successful. In 1480, Ivan, as of course the Prince of Muscovy, but also now the protector of the Eastern Orthodox Church, he refused to pay tribute to the Tatars. He said, "No, we're not going to pay you the money not to attack us." Well, then Ivan, before they could do anything, he had formed an army and he took the city of Novgorod, which had been held for 200 years by the Mongols. These were bold acts, and oddly enough, the Mongols did not fight back, despite their fierce reputation, certainly earned by their forebear, Genghis Khan. And it's almost like the old adage, if you stand up to a bully, they'll back down. That's what he did. And the Mongols did not really mount much of a counterattack. They continued hoarding elsewhere, basically. And you can imagine what that did to Ivan. Ivan's starting to really feel his oats now. He began calling himself the ruler of all Russians. And he began to act upon that. He began exercising control over the 30 or 40 large municipalities which made up, again, this Russian region of Eastern Europe. He revised a code of laws for Russia, moved the capital to Moscow, where, of course, it remains today, and he had the Kremlin rebuilt. The Kremlin is a magnificent fortress in Russia containing several palaces and cathedrals all in a single square. And guess who Ivan called in to redesign the Kremlin? He called in some of these Italian architects we talked about last week. Again, the Italian architecture and the new Renaissance style the word was getting out. And again, much like in Italy and in Western Europe, they were being influenced by memories of old Rome. It was happening in Russia as well. Even the term Tsar, which rulers of Russia would come to be called, it comes from an ancient Rome as a derivative of Caesar, in case you didn't know that. Now, again, when you marry the power of the crown and the cross, usually mostly bad things happen. And there were lots of downsides to this newfound Russian nationalism. Ivan, again, feeling his oats, began to not seek advice from his closest advisors anymore. He began believing his own hype. He began to believe that, yes, he was divinely appointed by God to do all these great things. He gave power and land for those who supported him militarily. So, in effect, he set up another system of, we remember this term, feudalism, where he basically started that economic system in Russia, again, under feudalism. Serfs worked for their lords or landowners in exchange for food and shelter. And if it sounds a little bit like slavery, it kind of is, insofar as, particularly in the European version of feudalism, you had very little chance of being anything other than a serf if you were born a serf. Now, it was even worse in Russia, because under Ivan's rule, serfs could be bought and traded as if they were property. So this is not like slavery, this is slavery. Matter of fact, it wasn't until really the late 19th century that this form of serfdom was more or less officially ended in Russia. But they were under this system for 400 years. And what happened was the results of feudalism really impacted the culture of Russia. It created a very large, a vast underclass, a working poor class, if you want to call them that. And it really burned deep into the Russian culture and deep into Russian minds. And part of Russian nationalism is the belief of an absolute ruler. They're very comfortable with being told what to do. We've seen it when Russia was part of the head of the Soviet Union, of course, under communism, and we see it today, even though they are nominally a democracy, but they do have a very autocratic ruler in Vladimir Putin. So again, for all the good, bad, and indifferent that has caused and is causing Russia, it really began, the direct line of what we would call modern-day Russia began with Ivan the Great. We're going to go back to Europe, back to the far western end of Europe and the nation of Portugal. Of course, they share the Iberian Peninsula with Spain. And it was really while this spirit of Renaissance architecture and poetry was kicking in Italy, new sparks over in Russia. In Portugal, the spirit of exploration was really beginning to get hold. Again, for years, people thought the earth was flat, or at the very least that the ocean, vast though it was so inherently dangerous that it really was foolhardy to try to venture too far from your home land. Although, again, as information is exchanged, you start hearing these stories of these sailors who have gone far away and managed to come back. And of course, we know the Vikings, centuries before the Renaissance hit Europe, had landed actually in what's now North America. They founded Iceland and Greenland, of course. And so the Vikings had done some long-range exploration. The idea, and if you remember from, for those of you who were in our class last year, the Silk Road had been established, and there was some early trade between Europe and these wild, exotic cultures in Asia, China and whatnot, and India, of course, too. And it was still, it was rough to get there, but they, again, thanks to Marco Polo and others, there was some trade and some cultural trade being had between the East and the West. It sort of ended when Constantinople, the head of the Byzantine Empire, fell to the Seljuk Turks in 1453. It closed that land mass where Europe could go to Asia and vice versa. You'd have to go through that, and that was fraught with difficulty. What if we sail around it? Well, they started asking that question, and they didn't really have an answer. Now, just to back up a little bit, another necessity of that trade is in the East, Asia, India, they produce lots of spices, and spices were becoming increasingly important, not just because they make your food taste good, but they make the food last longer. Pepper was especially valued. Spices were used mainly as a food preservative, and if you could make your food last 3 times as long as you could otherwise, that's a big, big deal. No more spoiled meat, or less of a chance of it. So you had that economic incentive. If we can find a way to reestablish those trade routes, there'll be a lot of people interested, and a lot of people will pay a lot of money for our spices if we can do this. So that pushed the spirit of exploration. Another part of it was genuine Christianity. Many Christians of Portugal believed it was their duty to share the gospel of Jesus beyond their borders. So enter someone named Prince Henry the Navigator. He was the son of the King of Portugal. He was a very devout Christian, part of a religious order called the Order of the Christ. Those members, again, saw themselves like crusading knights of the Crusades. They were concerned about the spread of Islam, and they abhorred the idea of taking slaves, which was fairly common in Islamic cultures, and they were keenly interested in spreading Christianity. Henry was so dedicated that he took a very personal interest in this. Although he did not sail, he was very, very influential in encouraging other explorers to make the trip, and he would staff them, give them, of course, funds needed for that. Some believe that that there were other mysteries of the East, so you start getting more than just this intellectual curiosity. You're getting a real economic incentive. Man, what if we could sail around the southernmost part of Africa and get over there? Couldn't it be done? I mean, this is like 10 times longer than any sea journey that any European had taken to this point. So we'll enter the age of exploration. The first significant one was Bartolomeu Dias. He was asked to sail around the Cape of Africa by King John II of Portugal. The king paid for the trip. Prince Henry the Navigator, of course, encouraged it. And their first foray, they got as far south as the Canary Islands off the northern coast of Africa. And the sailors, being a superstitious lot, they turned around and came back. And that happened 13 more times. They got to the Canary Islands, and the sailors thought, boy, that's far enough. We've been at sea for 4 weeks now. You'd have to be daft. Well, the 15th time was the charm here. As Bartolomeu Dias got a party group, they sailed south of the Canary Islands. They stayed right on the coastline of Africa, keeping the land in sight all the time. And eventually, lo and behold, they sailed across this, the Cape of Good Hope, as it would come to be known, the southernmost tip of Africa. And so from here, you're halfway home to Asia. Unfortunately for Dias, there was a big, big storm, like the day after they got around the Cape of Good Hope. And the sailors there said, nah, we're not going to go any further. Not going to go any further. This is it. No more. And they didn't. They staged a sit-down strike. So Dias, being the only one who wanted to continue sailing, and about 100 others that did not, they had to turn around and come back. But they had passed the Cape of Good Hope. They have shown that it was possible. It was named the Cape of Good Hope by Prince Henry and by King John of Portugal in the hopes that this would encourage other people to go around it. Cape of Good Hope. Sounds nice, right? I could sail that. So yeah, they intentionally named it something innocuous like this to try to convince other explorers to make that trip. Well, a gentleman by the name of Vasco da Gama took him up in 1497. He actually invited Dias to go along with him, just because he almost made it. They made it around the Cape one time. But interesting, though, that da Gama sailed way off the coast of Africa, went almost directly due south, then due east, to get better winds, the trade winds, of course, so they call it, following the jet stream and whatnot. And he did it. Within another month and a half, I believe, they ended up in the Indian city of Calicut. They had made it. They had not only sailed around the Cape, but they had sailed up into the Indian Ocean and landed in India. They had a lot of losses, though. At least 100 of his sailors got scurvy, which is a vitamin C deficiency. Hard to keep fruit fresh at sea, even though they did stop in some ports along the way. These are new ports. You don't know what they have. They had been at sea, actually, for close to 10 months, the total part of this journey. Once they got into India, they were not the least bit welcome. They were people, the Arabs, Muslims, had control of the trade in India, and they had no interest whatsoever in sharing their bounty with these Europeans. So they basically were very hostile to them, attacked them a couple of times. They made it out by the skin of their teeth with very few spices. However, because they made it back, they were treated like conquering war heroes. Da Gama was named Admiral of the Seas. In 1503, 6 years later, Da Gama returned to India, once again sailing around the Cape of Good Hope. This time he went prepared to fight the Arabs. Evidently they bought some guns and swords with him, and unfortunately there were some innocent victims. In the harbor of Calcutta, they sunk a vessel, an Arab ship holding 300 Muslim pilgrims who were making their journey towards Mecca. It was unnecessary violence, but Da Gama, again, was interested in a show of force. His demands were heard, and the trade routes were eventually reestablished to the east and the west. And of course, his success begat more success. And as more and more explorers learned that, yes, you can make this journey, you got to stock up beforehand, obviously. But those trade routes were reestablished, and history was changed because of that economic incentive to go exploring, to go to other lands. Others did it, and with all the good and bad that followed from that, and we will look at both of them. For our final part of the lesson today, we're going to go back to Italy, and we're going to talk about another member of the de' Medici family. This one was, remember our old friend Cosimo last week? This one is Lorenzo. He was the grandson of Cosimo, and he was evidently quite a popular feller with the population there. He, like his grandfather, very intellectually curious, loved the classics, deeply appreciated the arts, passionate for music and for poetry. He adopted, again, like his grandfather, he would take books that had loaned, he would loan them out to people just to share the knowledge. And again, like his grandfather, his interests were primarily in the Greek and Roman history. Remember, the de' Medicis were a family of bankers who were the rulers of Florence. And unfortunately, if you're in a high position, you're going to make enemies, and evidently rival bankers and the Archbishop of the Church of Rome were enemies of the de' Medici family, and they plotted an assassination of the Medici brothers, Lorenzo and his older brother, on Easter morning, 1478, while they were at church. These were not nice people. In the middle of worship, his brother was stabbed in the chest and killed, and Lorenzo was more fortunate, and he only got badly cut in the attack. His friends quickly surrounded him and led him safely out of the church. And of course, because de' Medici was very, very popular with the people, there were riots after the people learned what had happened. The Archbishop used this opportunity to try to rouse the crowd against the Medici family. He yelled freedom to them, but in shock, the crowd chanted in favor of the Medicis. Long live the balls, they said, because the Medici family crest had little balls all around it. The Archbishop and the banker were captured and hanged. Now, Archbishop is high up in the church. This makes the Pope look very bad. So Pope Sixtus, the fourth of Rome, heard about the Archbishop being hung, and he excommunicated Lorenzo from the church, and he began waging an actual war against Lorenzo too. He made an alliance with the King of Naples, another one of the Italian cities, to attack the Medicis and to take over Florence. Lorenzo, in a very bold move, decided not to fight, but he personally went to Naples, unarmed, unaccompanied, to speak face-to-face with the king who was challenging him. That took some nerve. That took guts. And King Ferrante was the name of the king of Naples. And he was intrigued with this man who was so bold to come unaccompanied, unarmed. He talked to him. Evidently, Lorenzo was quite a charmer, because soon King Ferrante was on his side. He was very, very impressed with the caliber of Lorenzo. And so the king of Lorenzo grew to have some great respect, and so the war was canceled. The city and the army that the Pope was trying to use to leverage against Lorenzo, I like this guy. Awesome. So Lorenzo returned to Florence, where he was still king and still very popular. He appointed a council of 70 men to help him run the affairs of Florence. He called it the Council of 70. And evidently, this very collaborative approach to governance worked. Crime went down, prosperity went up. Lorenzo, again, was very much loved. And like we said, he was very intellectually curious. He was a poet, less of a scholar and more of a socialite than his grandfather Cosimo was. But he would perform some of the songs he wrote in the streets. Again, a real man of the people type stuff. His passion for music and poetry ran pretty deep. He wrote love sonnets, nature poems, sacred hymns. And another thing he did, which is not a small thing, he began turning Italy back towards their native language, away from Latin. He thought the Italian language is something that was worth continuing, was worth speaking, was worth reviving, to have, this common thread that brings people together. It was not a small thing. Again, if you're looking for the idea behind a nation, one of the things is common threads. And certainly very few things are more unifying than a common language. He was also a great patron of the arts. By patron, we mean someone who supported it and who paid artists to do work. He was a big fan of a painter named Sandro Botticelli. And at a young age, Botticelli captured de' Medici's eye, and he began commissioning paintings from him. And Botticelli was a master. He brought ancient mythology to life through paintings. Primavera, the centaur, Venus and Mars. The goddesses that he created in these masterpieces are so lifelike, they look like they're going to reach out and talk to you. Just incredible realism. Remember, we talked about the realism that was part of Renaissance art. Botticelli had a very good relationship with a local bishop, and at one point in his life, he stopped painting anything other than religious paintings. And of course, his religious paintings were spectacular. Annunciation, the Madonna, and etc. I even painted a bunch of scenes to illustrate Dante's Divine Comedy. Unfortunately for Lorenzo, he did not live a long life. He died at the age of 43, but he did do some magnificent things for Florence, and again, kept that Renaissance momentum going into the 16th century. We will talk about this more on Monday, and hopefully have some good things to chat about. Hope you enjoy your weekend, and we will see you on Monday.